Just make sure the noticing is clear for today on the internet for everybody in case people are listening in on the internet for you. We thought it made best sense to because you've got some carryover from yesterday, to really run today's meeting as publicly noticed for the first part, so people that were planning on coming for your board meeting are here when they thought the board meeting was going to be, even though we knew this was going to be a bit chaotic, the schedule, so we gave flexibility in the public notice, but just so people don't miss what they want to hear. So we were going to go ahead, obviously, right now with your comp committee. It's posted for 8:30, and we were going to follow that with the governance committee, which was posted for 9:30, and then the board meeting is posted for 10:30. So we would go ahead and do that. And then Dana, it's you've got a small closed session in the board meeting. It's possible you might want to consider just kind of doing that with right at lunchtime, right in there.
Working lunch.
Yeah, and then Sharon, I defer to you whether you'd like to do closed or open first or second. I don't know if you have a preference now.
I think we'll do open because of I think stakeholders might still want to stick
Just
around
over here?
those items.
Okay.
Open and then we'll end.
Okay, so it's possible for those in the audience that are interested in the investment agenda. I'm just going to do a bit of a guess here, but it looks like that'd be about right after lunch, about 1 or 1:30. The investment committee would start again. Does that work for all the board members if we go with that route? Good. I think that sticks to the noticing requirements the best. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. So with that, Ms. Wilkins, would you call the roll for us, please?
Yes. Ms. Dillon?
Here.
Ms. Hendricks?
Here.
Ms. Vargas?
Here.
The Director of Finance, Ms. Ortega? Chairperson Keeley, you have a quorum.
Thank you. Item 1 on the agenda is the approval of the work plan for today. Entertain a motion to approve. Been moved and properly seconded. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. Item 2 is the approval of the minutes from April 6th, 2016 of the Comp Committee. Entertain a motion to approve.
Summary.
Moved and seconded. Any discussion, amendments? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. Item number 3 is the recommendations for incentive performance criteria for the risk mitigating strategies, also known as RMS, Innovation, Risk, Global Equity, Private Equity, and updates to the benchmark definitions. Melissa, what's the correct pronunciation of your last name again?
Norcia.
Norcia. Ms. Norcia is going to be here walking us through this item, as well as Mr. Neil Rue from PCA and Stephen McCourt from Makita, who have both weighed in on the recommendation, and as you can see, they've concurred with it. I'll turn it over to Ms. Norcia for the presentation and then questions or comments from the committee.
Okay, thank you. So this item does cover a few areas for your review and consideration for approval. And I'll just touch on those at a high level. So PCA has provided a recommendation for incentive performance criteria for the new RMS asset class structure. The other piece is a recommendation by PCA that global equity asset class incentive measures be updated to reflect a regional area first, which is the U.S. and non-U.S., and then secondly by the investment management strategy of active versus passive. The third area is a recommendation by Makita that private equity performance scale be reduced from 150 to 70 basis points. If you recall, that hurdle was reduced back in 2014 from 300 basis points to 150 basis points. So this assessment really is just kind of a check-in on if that was the appropriate mark for private equity. And lastly, there are some updates to the benchmark definitions to the compensation administrative procedures that are in alignment with some changes that were approved to the investment policy. As Harry mentioned, both PCA, Neil Rue, and Stephen McCourt with Makita are here to answer any questions you may have relative to the recommendations. In addition, you were provided additional feedback from global governance advisors on these recommendations as well. So if you have any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Norcia. Any questions from the committee or comments for Ms. Norcia? Ms. Ortega, good morning.
Yeah. Hello. I have a few questions, starting with the change in the RMS. So I think generally I am hesitant about moving from quantitative to qualitative measurements. So I kind of wanted to hear a little bit more about the justification for that and how the decision was made on the percentages, how it's allocated across. And then also wanted to understand if once the RMS is fully implemented, if there would be a reversion back to more quantitative measures. And if so, how is that built into the proposal here?
Thank you. I'll go ahead and have Neil, and I see Chris Ailman is approaching.
Sure. The reason for the beginning with the quantitative is the recognition that the program is ramping up, and qualitative. Sorry, and in the beginning of most programs, there's a bit of a J curve, but not as much. And right now we have such a small amount, it would really skew because we use the 3-year returns. So it is our plan over time as they move up the RMS allocation to move more back to the traditional, where the qualitative will be only 20%, the asset class will be 50%. So it's just a recognition of the start of the program.
And I'd just highlight, we're trying to get these parameters all put in. Staff is being very proactive. They're trying to move and structure an RMS team that's going to be, by and large, hopefully the initial stages of that in place by July 1 of this year. So the goal is to get all of the structure and the framework in place. Obviously, that framework can be modified as the class ramps up. The class is very new. It's evolving very quickly. There's some timelines for that, but that's not going to be the formal structure of that. The class is not going to be tightened probably for 12 to 18 months. And at that point, all this stuff will be under review. Until that time, you really can't nail down the benchmarks all that tightly. So it makes sense that the qualitative aspects, which is really focusing on the milestones of implementation versus relative performance versus a benchmark. So that's the idea.
And one thing I want to bring up, Marina, you raised a good question about the innovation side. That's one we've actually really struggled with because you want to reward your innovation team for doing research. And, I think we've learned from 3M and some of the laboratories that some of their best stuff is where they experiment on something and it doesn't work. Like Stephen and the team would investigate an area and decide not to invest in it. I don't know how to reward them for that knowledge gain. So that's why we made that more qualitative, and it probably will stay there. And I think as we learn from GGA and others more about how do you reward sort of scientists that experiment, it's more of a subjective issue, and that's why we have that one tilted that way. But RMS would change. Risk is the same thing, that the risk units, we're near the forefront of public pensions on risk units. We'd like to develop more of quantitative criteria in that area, but it's still trying to grasp how do you do it to measure risk. So our intent, and the board has historically preferred not to have qualitative, and we understand that. We just think we need it as a way to migrate to a quantitative over time.
So I think I could be comfortable with that explanation, although I guess what I would ask the chair is if rather than waiting for the staff to bring back recommendations for moving back towards quantitative, that we actually ask that there be check-ins, maybe whatever the milestones are for the implementation of RMS, that we actually have a discussion about where the incentives are and kind of get it on the same track so that we're not just waiting until it comes to us, that we're actually asking for a check-in on.
Sure. So why don't we do this, if it's appropriate, and I completely concur with Ms. Ortega's suggestion and would ask that we pursue it, and that is, as she stated, a monitoring of the check-in rather than being reported to us, so that we would incorporate that then into some reports that we get next year throughout the fiscal year. Is that right?
Absolutely reasonable, and I would explain that it's easy for us to do because you can only change comp basically once a year. That's what the lawyers tell us. And you're going to see the size of RMS in the asset allocation all the time. So we'll all be able to see and have that visibility of when it's 2% of the portfolio, when it's at 4% of the portfolio, and that will help trigger these discussions of, hey, this coming July we need to move it again and move it again.
Great.
Okay, so everyone's clear on that there will be a reporting in and a checking in as to the progress that we're making, as opposed to here's what they've accomplished. Anything else, Ms. Ortega?
Yeah, I did want to also talk about the private equity change, and I will say this one really kind of throws me for a loop because we just changed it in 14, and so I'm kind of I don't feel like I understand at all how we kind of said 2 years ago that there was a major problem with the benchmark we were using, and now we're back again so quickly. So I need a little help understanding that issue.
Yeah, so just by way of background, prior to 2 years ago, the policy benchmark for private equity was a public market stock index. And you would expect any private equity portfolio that's well diversified over time to outperform the public markets. And your incentive comp was based on a margin, had a ceiling of margin of outperformance of 300 basis points. When your private equity consultant changed the benchmark, they changed it from a public market index to essentially a peer universe of private equity funds. Moving to a peer universe, which in and of itself should be expected to outperform the public markets, one has to make a judgment as to how much a pension fund should be expected to outperform that peer universe. Is going to be a different and smaller number than inability to outperform the public markets. The recommendation of that time was 150 basis points, but it was clearly indicated that that number should be monitored closely because there's no clear evidence of whether it's too high or too low. So we were asked to come back, 2 years later with additional experience here. The larger issue with the private equity benchmark is that the private equity benchmark being used today doesn't represent the opportunity set that's available to CalSTRS, both because CalSTRS invests in some programs, as we talked about yesterday, like the proactive program, that is not represented in the benchmark. And CalSTRS doesn't have an ability, because of its size, to invest in some sectors to the same level that are represented in the benchmark, like venture capital. Our initial analysis of other large public pension plans in the U.S. is that at least over the last 10-year period, the average public pension plan underperformed the peer benchmark you're using by about 200 basis points a year. So the index you're using isn't a representative of sort of the average experience of public pension plans in private equity for those reasons. So as a consequence, we looked at the margin and thought that 150 basis points was too high. 70 basis points is certainly moving in the right direction, but with additional time, I think what this committee should consider is actually changing the policy benchmark to something that more closely reflects the opportunity set that the staff has. But that requires a bit more work to investigate different benchmarks, different indexes. The one thing I wanted to address.
Could you just stop for a second? I want to make sure I understood one of the main points you just made there. The opportunity set that our staff in private equity, because of the unique nature of the program, is different than most other public pension funds because of the unique nature of some of the carve-outs within private equity or directions that we've gave, and that as a result, that's skewing how we perform against the benchmark?
Yeah, it's different than how the benchmark is constructed.
So you're essentially saying at some future date we need to look at that to reconcile that decision that we've made.
Yeah, if you want to base your performance compensation on whether your staff is outperforming a sort of objective opportunity set of funds that could be invested in, you should look at what that objective set is, and the current benchmark doesn't match that.
If I can jump in, Stephen wasn't here yesterday when the two Makita people presented. So if you remember that slide, they showed not just the one where it showed the outperformance, underperformance by class, but the next slide they showed had all the differences between us and the benchmark. So proactive and clean tech are in our portfolio, not in the benchmark. They showed that the benchmark had a lot more venture that we couldn't have, and that we were, because of our size, naturally more overweight buyouts. So part of this arena is the board shifted the benchmark. You know, first we were public markets plus 300. Well, then we went to a benchmark that was already included that 300 and added 150. And now what they're saying is, well, that extra reach even higher. Your benchmark's now here. Bring it down to 70 over our peers. And we're realizing that the things in that benchmark probably need to be adjusted. So it's the fine tuning of the benchmark. I think I remember Dana saying at the time, feels like we're going pretty fast to this new benchmark. It's been a learning lesson. And we thought it was pretty close to our peer universe as we've dissected it. And now we have a new consultant in private equity. They're dissecting it. We'll come back to you with some fine tuning to make that a more accurate measure of how private equity is doing.
And just to address one of the items brought up in the GGA memo, we went back and recalculated the performance on a fiscal year basis of your private equity program. In each of the last 10 years, it wouldn't have mattered had your margin been 150 basis points or 70 basis points. The program would have paid the same amount of performance compensation. So the ceiling on the performance comp that they're shooting for is not as powerful a governor of the performance comp as the benchmark is that you choose. And so I just wanted to highlight that as well.
So, Tager, any other questions?
No, I look forward to talking about having a benchmark that better measures the program.
I would ask that we put that, as we do the agenda for next year, we'll place that on the comp committee agenda work plan for next year.
Sorry, can I just...
Sure, Mr. Dillon.
Just to connect everything for everybody. Oop, there we go. Connect everything for everybody. Almost any time when you guys talk about a benchmark, the investment committee should have probably talked about it ahead of time. And the things that Stephen's talking about will actually first go through the investment committee to make adjustments to the private equity policy. And then naturally, anything they do to the policy, will automatically then flow into the comp stuff. So,
Point well taken. We'll follow the appropriate process, and when it's appropriate for it to land at this committee's level in the next fiscal year, it will.
You're chairing that too. So.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Can I just ask?
Appreciate that.
Can I just...
Vote of confidence. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Ms. Dillon and then Ms. Hendricks.
You can actually skip me if you
Okay.
click on her
Sure.
and then click the box up the top. It should skip me.
It's taken me 4 years to figure that out.
I know, I
With your
still
help,
can't
Dana, we
figure
did
that
it.
out.
Ms. Hendricks.
I can't do the leapfrog. So I was just curious when you think that'll come up on the investment committee for next year. Are we planning on discussing that in the fall or something?
It's really up to Makita. They have had a process. Now that they're the new consultant, they've been going step by step. If you remember, yesterday was step 2 for them. We were just debating, Steve Hardy and I were talking yesterday about, how big's the September agenda? They want to come back with more dissection in September and then maybe November. But I think, what were you going to add, Stephen?
September is what we would aim for unless there were time constraints.
Okay. Great. Thanks. That's it.
Anyone else with a question or comment?
Just me.
Okay.
Oh, I got knocked out, sorry.
Ms. Dillon.
Alrighty. So my questions are along the same lines. Did we choose the peer group? I mean, it's not like we just said, oh, there's a peer group out there. We actually decided who would be in that peer group. So when we took a look at it, we were probably just going back to it. Go ahead.
Sorry,
Chris.
yeah, so because this, for Stephen's sake, this is Mike Moy from PCA, who was the private equity consultant at the time. There aren't that many peer benchmarks. We had explained there was Venture Economics, Cambridge, and the State Street benchmark. The other two had flaws, and we were not allowed to publicly display them, so that's a big problem for us.
Right.
we knew broadly the constituents, but we don't get to pick which peers are in it. It is everybody that reports into the State Street database that uses that as a tracking system. If funds leave, they're out. If a new fund comes in, it's in. And now that we know the subcomponents of that, okay, how many of these people are endowments? What's the weightings? That's what's helped to have the new deeper dive with Makita sort of tearing the index apart.
Because wasn't there a comment yesterday, Chris, that there are entities out there that won't even invest with us that are
Oh, yes.
included in the benchmark?
Absolutely.
So the opportunity set that Stephen's talking about, I think.
Right.
Does that mean then we can go ahead and customize?
So
Yeah,
there's two ways to get to a more precise benchmark. One is you customize the benchmark, and we can look into doing that. The other is you carve out pieces of the track record of CalSTRS track record when comparing it to State Street, and you compare it sort of on a sector basis. So there's a couple of ways of skinning that cat, and we'll be looking at both of those.
Alrighty. And just forgive me, my iPad went to sleep. In one of the recommendations, Neil, coming out of PCA is to take a look at the whole investment staff incentive compensation model. That then too would also go through investments and then work its way back up towards us.
I don't know the exact process, but that's been a message in all our comp memos since we've been reviewing these things over the last year or so. And RMS is a great example of that. This class is really not about relative performance of some manager. It's about risk management versus the total portfolio. Right. So you could end up, we're basically, one of Ms. Ortega's comments, we're basically taking the RMS and putting it in the existing framework first. But maybe we need to be looking at the framework now in a little bit more rigorous manner. And RMS is a great experimental class for that because its focus is not on relative performance. Right. It's on total risk management versus the total portfolio.
So, Chris, if we were to look at the incentive compensation model, does that begin here with us, or does that flow through investments first?
No, it's. I would envision that actually being a compensation. It's more of a philosophical standpoint of how do you want to incentivize that group. As we always say, RMS is almost like an insurance policy for the portfolio. You're incentivizing them to get the best, highest rated, cheapest insurance policy. But what you might want to really incentivize them to do is that when we have that problem, our insurance policy paid off, and it's. So I would say that'll probably reside in comp. It'll be one of those philosophical discussions of what's the right way to incentivize us and the staff. And I think what PCA keeps saying is, remember our discussions we've had in the investment committee of absolute versus relative return? We are compensating, and we have to, because we want to be quantitative on relative return performance. But really, you are judged on absolute. Is the plan healthier? Is funding improved? And we'll always, I think, struggle, because there's nobody in the industry I'm aware of that's been able to figure out how do you align incentives with that sort of absolute. And I think PCA is bringing up the right point. There needs to be some mixture. I can beat our benchmarks like crazy, but the plan might actually not get healthy. And that would be a disconnect.
So, Harry, maybe we can put that on next year's work plan.
Yeah.
Also then.
Ms. Dillon and I will be chairing and vice chairing the investment committee, so we'll make it a point to have an offline conversation with Mr. Rue and Ms. Norcia to discuss this concept further, and if appropriate, we'll pursue exploring it, because there are some other issues relative to, for example, our compensation and benchmarks in the public markets. For example, we have carve-outs, we're calling them special mandates. To what extent does that impact compensation, and does it negatively drag on compensation? Does it have no impact? I think that would be an interesting thing to look at as well, because of the unique nature of some of the decisions that we're making. But that's not agendized, so we won't pursue that. But Ms. Hendricks and Ms. Dillon and I will follow up with Ms. Norcia and Mr. Rue and anyone else who is appropriate to have an offline conversation about this very issue. Thanks. Any other comments? Okay, seeing none, I'd entertain a motion to, on item 3, there's a recommendation, and there was amendments or modest changes proposed by Ms. Ortega, so they would be considered part of the motion.
So moved.
Been moved. Second? Is there a second?
No.
It's been moved and properly second to approve the recommendation, item 3. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, that passes. Thank you very much. Item 4 is the system actuary compensation evaluation. And I know we have Michael Oakes from McLagen is on the conference phone with us for this item. Before I turn this over to Ms. Norcia, I do want to comment that in preparation for this item, we've had extensive conversations about, the mission critical nature of the position. We talked about retaining people that we want to retain in the organization. We talked about the really our main competitor and what the comp level is there for this position, and the cost to the system relative to if we were to lose someone in this position and how difficult it would be to refill it. I know we have commentary from McLagen on this, and there are 2 options for us to at least initially begin to have a conversation about. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Ms. Norcia and Mr. Oakes from McLagen. Ms. Norcia.
Thank you. I think you covered it quite well. Michael Oak is, Michael Oak is with us via conference call, and I'll turn it over to him to continue the presentation and conversation. Michael, are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. We can.
Great. Sorry I couldn't make it there in person, but I can assure you my face hasn't changed much since you last saw me in April.
Mm-hmm.
So what we were asked to do is assemble competitive data. So consistent with your pay philosophy, we assembled a composite which is 67% weighted to public funds and 33% weighted to private sector firms. For the sake of timeliness, I think you guys have seen this from us before. So if you just wanted to go to the third page of our presentation, which is Comp 28-5, which has the bar chart of CalSTRS current. The header is CalSTRS current salary range lags competitive total cash. So here, I just wanted to point out that your salary on a salary-only basis versus competitor salary is competitive, meaning if you were to look, for example, at the first 3 bars on that page, the gray bar, which is your current range, and the dark blue bar, the third bar, are pretty consistent. However, in the competitive market, there's also incentive compensation, which isn't currently offered at CalSTRS. So if you focus on the rightmost bar, which is that dark blue bar, that's the competitive range when you think of total cash, salary plus incentive. And as your administrative provisions state, your compensation philosophy is to target median total cash. So with that philosophy in mind, if you go to the next page, which talks about 2 alternatives, we presented 2 alternatives. The first being, and if I'm going too fast or too slow, please just jump in. The 2 alternatives, the first one is to say we want to have CalSTRS salary on a salary-only basis. We don't want to reintroduce the incentive plan for this position, but we still want to provide competitive total cash levels, meaning essentially we want our salary to approximate what someone could be earning if they were in a salary plus incentive opportunity. And the right-hand side, and I'll go through these numbers in a minute, the right-hand alternative 2 is to say, well, what if we did reintroduce the incentive for this position? What would we have to do to our salary, and what would we have to do in terms of incentive levels? So the first alternative, going back to the left-hand side of the page, we put the midpoint at $300,000 and calculated the range for min and max from that. And on the I know one of the questions will likely come up if you look at this and look at the right-hand side of the page and say, well, I see that the maximum incentive, if I have salary plus incentive, is 313. So why aren't these numbers the same? So if our philosophy is to target median total cash, why wouldn't we be trying to put the midpoint at the same number? And our take on that was that, for example, the right-hand side of the page, that 313 number represents the maximum possible compensation. It doesn't mean that's the compensation someone's going to earn every year. In fact, each year it will likely be less than that unless you're maximizing your incentive every year, which is unlikely. So the take-home pay on the right-hand side of the page will actually be less than the 313 number. That just represents the total opportunity. So we took in a sort of a discretionary fashion with using round numbers to say 300 on a salary-only basis may approximate what someone might expect if they were in a salary plus incentive program. Now, neither one of these options is necessarily better or worse than the other. It's just sort of a matter of the committee's appetite for introducing an incentive plan for this position. So going to the next page, just so you could see how alternative one would compare to market. On a salary-only basis, so if you, again, adopted this midpoint of 300, you can see that the salary range, the charts on the left-hand side of the page, are higher, obviously, than the salary-only, both for your neighbors down the street as well as the competitive market. However, on the right-hand side of the page, the salary-only would be a little bit less than the midpoint for the competitive market in terms of your specific peer group, and still a discount toward CalPERS. On page 6, you look at the same analysis to say, well, what if we had a salary plus incentive? In this case, the salary is pretty close to CalPERS. Again, we use round numbers, not to have too much specificity here. A little bit higher than the competitive market, and then with adding that 25% incentive opportunity, it basically brings you to the midpoint exactly to the competitive market, and as you can see, a discount to your neighbors down the street. So I know I went through that quickly. Hopefully you recognize this format of the data. You've seen it from us before. I guess there's probably, if there are questions about the data, the methodology, or the alternatives, please ask and we can walk through those.
Thank you, Mr. Oak. I'll turn it over to the committee for questions or comments at this point. Ms. Ortega?
I had a question about the evaluation process. So it says in the slides that the incentive would be weighted 100% towards qualitative factors. And is this a board evaluation position, or would it be the CEO's evaluation?
It would be the CEO.
Okay.
Evaluate that.
And with the exception of the CEO, would this be the only position that's non-investment branch that has an incentive award tied to it?
Correct.
Well, all of the executives are incentivized, and they are evaluated by the CEO.
Yeah, I don't think all the executives, because GGA raised the issue about not every position, similar sized roles are given an incentive opportunity.
All of the executives that are non-statutory are evaluated by the CEO and have an incentive opportunity. The only two that have not been are the general counsel and the system actuary.
But granted, those others are obviously CEA positions.
Yeah.
That's why they're not addressing that from McLagen, because those are CEA.
Right. Right.
Civil service positions, they're not part of the board's authority to set compensation.
Okay, so the CEA positions do have an incentive opportunity.
15%.
15%. Okay. So that's considerably different than what's being proposed here, right? I mean. Okay.
Well, I mean, this is the complicated part of this situation with our whole compensation structure. We've got, for the non-investment staff, if they were market-based positions for the CFO or other positions, there would be different compensation levels for both the cash and the incentive side. This so happens this position is in the statutory position, so it's eligible for a more market-based approach to compensation. The problem is, I mean, do we push everything around internal equity, or do we recognize that and as we have in the investment staff, that the competitive market has a real bearing on the quality of the staff? That's just the friction point we have in this discussion, and you do have. I mean, we have to say you have key man risks on these issues. It's not just abstract discussions on what we're talking about, these numbers, but they're extremely key risks to the organization. So. It's the quandary I struggle with too. You know, done otherwise, we would have all the senior level of the staff in a comprehensive compensation plan with strong internal and external equity. But given the complexion of this state system, we've got some positions in and some positions out. So this one is out of the state comp plan and in your hands, and so we use more of an external market comparison. And as Cassandra and Melissa have said, we've got some extra risk around the contributions of this position to the financial stability of the organization.
And aside from this, the incentive can be assigned at whatever level. It's the total cash competitive market that we're trying to target. That's why there was two alternatives, whether we do that with just adjusting salary only or adding an incentive opportunity.
Yeah, we defer to you on how. That's why I hope you didn't hear advocacy around that. I mean, I think I hear your concern there, Irena. So that's why the consultants have provided a couple of different approaches here.
Okay.
Anything else, Mr. Ortega? The questions or comments from members of the committee before I weigh in? Okay. There's no comments or anyone in the queue at this point. As our CEO stated, there is some, I think his term he used, friction relative to, and also key person risks for the organization. And I've said it once, I've said it a number of times. Whenever we're talking about compensation, it's a difficult one to really get right. I mean, because we want our compensation to be externally competitive, and when I think about externally competitive, I think of the local market. I really don't, from my perspective, I don't see us competing with people that are living on 57th Street and 3rd Avenue in New York. This is Sacramento, right? We're not competing with. That's the reality. We're here in Sacramento. People make a choice to be here for lots of different reasons, and our chief competitor is across the river. To that point, I would like to make a request in these comments. I would like a simple document provided for us that shows us the positions that this committee has some authority over relative to compensation. So whatever those number of positions are, and how those positions are compensated relative to across the river. In just one sheet of paper, these are the positions. This is what the total comp is for these positions. Because decisions that we make send a message to the organization. So that's an awesome responsibility that we have. And we're being asked to make a decision to, and I support support us making some adjustment here to this position pay. But it also sends a message to other people in the organization when you start adjusting pay to the level that we're being asked to do here today. Ms. Norcia?
And just another comment, some of you may be aware that CalSTRS is going through a comprehensive compensation policy review study with Grant Thornton, which more than likely will put forth some significant changes in the coming year that we would want to keep tabs on.
I'd like to pursue just a little bit better understanding the question that Ms. Ortega raised and then CEO weighed in on. the incentive for this position, if we were to choose option, if we were to make a decision and choose option 2, is a 25% incentive, right?
Correct.
And the other like positions outside of investments that receive compensation, the maximum incentive they're entitled to is 15%. Is that correct?
For CEAs, yes.
Okay. So my initial thought is we can adjust the salary to improve the compensation and to send a message that we want to retain talent in this mission critical position. I'm less comfortable than having also a carve-out special 25% incentive comp when other people who are non-investment staffs are eligible for a maximum of 15%. That creates an inequity from my perspective internally that I sense we might have some control over mitigating. Now, I might be missing something where I have a blind spot, and I'd like to know what it is if there's something that I'm missing with that.
The only thing I would add is just that the assessment is just based on competitive market, right? All things removed with regards to that position.
Right.
Yeah.
But would it be could be argued that it's being offset by an increase in the base as well, right?
Yes.
I mean,
One other
yeah.
thought, and I think that this is what McLagen was included in their recommendations, is that the incentive levels for the system actuary are in line with the recommendation of 25%. So it wasn't just a guess, and this is similar to what CalPERS is paying an incentive, and in line with what they're moving towards in their adjusting salary levels up and incentive compensation down, with a long-term incentive that they're going to be tacking on to the end of that. So again, we're trying to target total cash, and with our peer group that we have established, we didn't want to go outside what the policy constructs of that we're governed by with the board, but within the realm of competitiveness for our organization and in line with CalPERS. So that's why I think that was one of the recommendations, was this was a competitive incentive to be applied to this position to hit total comp.
So from your perspective, which one puts us in the better position to say we're competitive with another, let's say CalPERS. Let's put it out. We want to compete with CalPERS. We want to keep people here. We don't want them to go to CalPERS. We want good talent to stay here.
I think the total comp with incentive opportunity puts us in line with more competitively, to be honest with you.
The one thing I do caution, I just want to put this out there. The one thing I worry about a little bit, and maybe it's an anxiety that I should just say, I don't need to be anxious about this, is that we start getting in this bidding war with one another. And then we start getting the systems, and I don't want to repeat yesterday's, events, but we start getting into a bidding war with each other. And you can see what that could lead to.
Right.
You get, people putting people like us in an awkward and compromised position because we wind up not having, the leverage seems to be all on the other side of the table, and so I'm mindful of that, and I think we need to be mindful of that, and to the extent that any of that is begins to surface, we need to be brutally honest with each other and say that's what's taking place here, and we're not going to tolerate it. Do you know what I mean? I don't want us to be held hostage by. These are strong terms, but this is an important issue. I don't want us to be held hostage by folks who, know that they have the upper hand on us. And I'm not articulating this as diplomatically as I would like to, but I think it's the reality of how do you attract and retain good talent in a pool.
Good, and I would be happy to respond to that. If you look at what we're setting the salaries at, we didn't change our peer group. We're just trying to realign it to what we should be competitive with. Yeah. We're not trying to compete with CalPERS. CalPERS is paying $100,000 a year more for this position. We didn't change our peer group. We're not trying to compete with their salary. We just want to be competitive to what we should pay for the position and the competencies and skills that we need to attract and retain staff to fulfill the actuarial obligations of the system. And so that's what we're trying to readjust. And I think that there's other things that, besides making sure that we're competitive with what the peer group that we've established, there's other things that keep people here, and we're lucky that we have a culture that does that. But again, we certainly don't want to look at the salary analysis and say, well, we're only paying part of what the position really is worth. We hope that we're good enough on the other end to keep you here without paying competent.
100%. Ms. Licknock, very well said. I completely agree with you. Ms.